Every engineer working a long grade in the 1860s knew the same feeling at the throttle. The locomotive under him was doing its job. The train behind him was not. He pulled the whistle cord twice and waited, and somewhere back along the cars he could picture the brakeman climbing out of the caboose and up onto the roofs, turning the iron wheels by hand, one car at a time, in the order they could reach them. He had no way of knowing how many had answered. He had no way of knowing how fast. The curve at the bottom of the grade was coming up at the speed the locomotive had set, not the speed the brakeman could deliver. And the man with his hand on the throttle, the man the passengers in the first coach trusted with their lives, had nothing in his cab that could stop his own train. This is the story of how that changed. The locomotive of the 1860s was already a serious machine. A standard American Type 440, the workhorse of the period, weighed in the neighborhood of 30 tons without its tender, carried a firebox hot enough to soften iron, and could pull a passenger consist at 50 miles an hour on the level. The engineer had a throttle, a reverse lever, a whistle, and a set of rudimentary brakes on the drivers of the locomotive itself. What he did not have was any connection at all to the brakes on the cars behind him. When he decided to stop, he could close the throttle, he could throw the engine into reverse in an emergency, and he could pull the whistle. Everything else in the train depended on men climbing onto the roofs. Those men were the brakemen, and the job was what it sounded like. Each freight car carried a vertical iron wheel mounted at one end of the roof, geared through a shaft to the brake rigging underneath. When the whistle sounded, brakemen climbed up from the caboose and from the head end and began working their way toward the middle of the train, bracing themselves against the wind, using a wooden club for leverage on each wheel, then jumping the gap to the next car. In good weather on straight track, a practiced man could set 4 or 5 cars in the time a train took to cover a mile. In sleet, in the dark, or on a grade where the cars were already surging against their couplers, the same work was close to impossible. The problem was not that the brakes themselves were weak. The problem was that they could not be applied at the same time. Every car on the train was its own small braking system acting alone. Some cars slowed early, some slowed late. Some never got their brakeman at all, because he had slipped, or because the roof was iced, or because a bridge clearance had forced him to drop flat as the train passed under it. The slack between cars snapped forward and back in ways that threw men off the tops of freight cars and tore couplers out of their pockets. On level track at low speed, that unevenness was tolerable. On a long downgrade out of the Alleghenies with a loaded consist behind a locomotive that weighed every bit as much as the cars it was pulling, it was a slow-motion disaster waiting for its moment. The cost was not hidden. Railroad accident records from the late 19th century show roughly 1,000 brakemen killed on American railroads every year, with another 5,000 maimed. Historians of workplace safety have estimated the annual death rate for brakemen at 8 per 1,000, more than double the rate in coal mining. When the newly formed Interstate Commerce Commission published its first accident statistics in 1889 and 1890, the numbers for trainmen shocked a traveling public that had never quite understood how the trains it rode were actually being stopped. The Brakeman's Brotherhood, organized in Hornellsville, New York, in 1873, functioned in part as a burial society, because ordinary insurance companies would not sell policies to men who worked the roofs of moving freight. The operational limit was just as hard. A train in regular service could not run much longer than 10 cars, because 10 was about the most the brakeman could reach in time. The locomotives were being built larger every year, the tracks were pushing into heavier country, and the train length that the machine was capable of pulling was capped by the number of roofs a man could run across before the curve at the bottom of the grade arrived. The locomotive was ahead of the system it was harnessed to. The men on top of the cars were the bottleneck, and they were paying for it in funerals. The country was asking more of the railroad every year. The Civil War had ended in 1865. The last spike of the transcontinental line was driven at Promontory Summit in 1869. Freight tonnage climbed. The rails pushed west through the Rockies and south through the Appalachians, into grades the early eastern lines had never attempted. Locomotive builders in Philadelphia and Paterson delivered heavier engines every year, taller drivers, larger fireboxes, more tractive effort at the coupler. Every one of those new locomotives was capable of pulling a longer train than the previous generation. None of them came with a way to stop that longer train from the cab. But the braking system did not keep pace with any of it. The same hand-brake wheel that had been adequate behind a small wood burner in 1850 was now being asked to control a heavier consist behind a heavier locomotive on a steeper grade, and it was not equal to the task. Every additional car added another point of uncoordinated force. Every extra mile of descent gave the slack more time to compound. The headlines arrived in their usual rhythm, passenger cars telescoping at stations because the train could not stop in time, freight consists running away at the foot of a mountain and piling into whatever was at the bottom, and the railroads, under pressure from state legislatures and from their own insurers, began to acknowledge in public what their engineers had always known. The locomotive had outgrown the train it was pulling. The industry did not accept the problem without trying to solve it. Inventors filed dozens of patents through the 1850s and 1860s. Chain brakes ran a heavy iron chain the length of the train, so a single man at the engine could tighten every car at once, but the chain stretched under load and applied the cars unevenly, and after a few public failures the idea was abandoned. Steam brakes piped live pressure from the locomotive back through the train, but steam condensed in the lines, lost pressure over distance, and was useless on a cold winter run in Pennsylvania. Vacuum systems were proposed, built in small numbers, and failed in the same predictable ways. Fleet operators also leaned harder on the men. Some lines hired more brakemen per train. Some added middle brakemen who rode in the open between cars, already in position when the whistle came. None of it solved the fundamental problem. Every one of those strategies was a way of managing uncoordinated force rather than eliminating it, and on a long enough grade with a heavy enough consist, the physics would eventually win. What the railroad needed was not more brakemen. It was a way for the engineer in the cab to act on every car of his own train by himself. The man who would eventually give him that was not, at first, interested in brakes. George Westinghouse was 19 years old in 1866, recently discharged from service in the Union Army and Navy, already carrying patents for a rotary steam engine and for a device that re-railed freight cars. What pulled him into the braking question was an accident. According to later accounts, he was riding a passenger train in upstate New York when it stopped on the main line for reasons no one in the coach could explain. He got down, as passengers sometimes did in that era, and walked forward along the tracks to see what had caused the delay. He found the aftermath of a head-on collision between two freight trains on single track. Witnesses told him that both engineers had seen each other coming. Both had signaled frantically for their brakemen. Both had watched their own locomotives roll into each other because neither train could stop in time. He was already a railroad man. He had already patented one device that served the railroad. But the picture of two engineers watching a collision they could not prevent, with the men on the roof still working the wheels as the distance closed, stayed with him in a way the other problems had not. He later wrote that the experience was the beginning of everything that followed. The mechanical breakthrough came 2 years later, and it came from an article about a tunnel. Westinghouse read, in a railroad magazine, that engineers boring the Mont Cenis tunnel through the Alps were using compressed air to drive rock drills at distances of nearly 1,000 yards from the compressor that supplied them. If compressed air could transmit that much force through that much hose, it could travel the length of a train. And if it could travel the length of a train, it could do what no brakeman could ever do fast enough. It could act everywhere at once. The concept he was working toward was rooted in something fundamental about how pressure moves through a closed system. A column of compressed air behaves as though it were nearly rigid. Open a valve at one end, and the pressure at the other end responds almost immediately, no matter how far the pipe runs. What the tunnel engineers had used to drive rock drills through solid stone would just as well drive brake shoes against the wheels of a freight car, and unlike steam, air would not condense on a cold night in the mountains of Pennsylvania. Westinghouse's design began at the locomotive. A steam-driven air pump, mounted on the engine and powered by the same boiler that pulled the train, compressed air into a reservoir carried on the locomotive. From that reservoir, a single pipe ran the length of the train, joined between cars by flexible hoses. A branch line on each car fed the compressed air into a brake cylinder. When the engineer wanted to stop, he moved one valve in the cab. Pressure traveled down the pipe, filled every cylinder at the same moment, and pushed every brake shoe against every wheel on every car. He was not the first to propose air as a braking medium. Several patents involving compressed air already existed when he filed his own. What he was first to do was bring the combination of components into a workable, commercial system, and make it work on the first run, in front of railroad executives who had already sat through a decade of failed demonstrations. The elegance of the arrangement was that it did not replace the brakeman with another brakeman. It replaced every brakeman on every car with one valve under the engineer's hand. The first patent was issued on April 13, 1869. Westinghouse was 22 years old. The New York Central and the Erie showed no interest. A subsidiary of the Pennsylvania Railroad known as the Panhandle Route agreed to equip a single passenger train for a demonstration run from Pittsburgh to Steubenville, Ohio, on the condition that Westinghouse cover the installation himself and pay for any damage if the brakes failed. He borrowed money from an old associate named Ralph Baggerly, fitted the cars, and invited a party of executives into the coaches for the first run. The demonstration, according to the Standard accounts, came within feet of becoming something else entirely. A horse and wagon were reportedly stranded on the rails just outside Pittsburgh as the locomotive came around a curve. The engineer applied the new brake. The train stopped in a distance that would have been impossible under any system the executives in those coaches had ever seen, inches from the wagon. Whether or not the details have hardened in retelling, the message the executives carried back was unambiguous. On September 28, 1869, the Westinghouse Air Brake Company was incorporated in Pittsburgh. Within 3 years, the straight air brake was standard equipment on passenger service throughout the Pennsylvania system, and other major lines were beginning to follow. The first design, however, was not yet fail-safe. A ruptured hose or a broken coupling anywhere on the train cut off the pressure, and without pressure, there were no brakes. In 1872, Westinghouse addressed that weakness with a second patent. Each car now carried its own air reservoir and a small device he called the triple valve. The train pipe was kept continuously pressurized during normal running, which held the brakes released against the force of the reservoirs. Any drop in line pressure, from the engineer's hand, from a severed hose, from a separated train, caused the triple valve on every car to release air from the car's own reservoir into the brake cylinder. The train now stopped itself when something went wrong. In 1887, tested on the West Burlington Hill in Iowa, a further refinement, the quick-action triple valve, solved the remaining problem of delayed application on the rear cars of long freight consists. Passenger railroads adopted the new brake quickly. Freight operators did not. Equipping the tens of thousands of freight cars already in service was estimated by the industry itself to cost close to $40 million. And for more than 2 decades the freight lines resisted, argued, and lobbied. The brakemen kept climbing the roofs. The casualty lists kept appearing in the trade press. The mutual aid societies kept paying the burial costs that the insurers still would not. In 1893, Congress passed the Safety Appliance Act, which required air brakes and automatic couplers on all rolling stock used in interstate service. The railroads asked for, and received, 2 extensions of the deadline. By 1905, according to figures published by the Westinghouse Air Brake Company, about 89,000 locomotives and 2 million freight and passenger cars in the United States were running on the Westinghouse system, and the whistle followed by men scrambling up onto moving cars had become, almost everywhere on the continent, a piece of the previous century. The plant at Wilmerding, Pennsylvania, built 13 miles east of Pittsburgh on the Pennsylvania Railroad's main line, was producing 1,000 sets of brakes a day by 1905 and employing 3,000 men. The engineer in the cab now had, under his right hand, a brake valve that reached every car of the train he was pulling. The locomotive and the train were finally one machine. Every safety system that followed on American rail, the automatic coupler, the block signal, the power switch, the dead man's control, the positive train control of our own era, was built on the assumption that the engineer could bring his own train to a stop by himself. The air brake did not eliminate danger on the railroad. Trains still derailed, couplers still broke, grade crossings still killed. The handbrake itself never fully disappeared. Every freight car in North America still carries one today, as an emergency reserve for a train left standing on a siding without air. But it gave the men at the throttle something they had never had before. A way to stop every car of a train at the same moment, from one hand, without waiting for a man on a roof to answer the whistle. The locomotive had finally caught up with the train it was pulling.